The millionaire CEO received a call from the hospital. "Sir, you're her sole emergency contact." Ethan Hale had everything a man could want: power that moved markets, wealth that built empires, and a reputation that made boardrooms fall silent when he entered. But beneath the tailored suits and cold authority was a man haunted by a single regret. Her name was Clara Bennett. She'd been his assistant for 3 years, quiet, efficient, the kind of person who anticipated his needs before he voiced them. She never asked for recognition, never sought the spotlight. She just showed up, day after day, with coffee at dawn and gentle reminders that he was human. They'd grown close in ways he refused to acknowledge. And when she resigned without explanation, saying only that she needed to find herself, Ethan let her walk away. It was easier than admitting she mattered, easier than facing what he felt. 2 years passed. He buried himself deeper in work, convinced he'd made the right choice, until his phone rang on a rainy Thursday evening. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, detached. "Mr. Hale, this is Mercy General Hospital. You've been listed as the sole emergency contact for Miss Clara Bennett. She was brought in unconscious an hour ago." The words hit him like a freight train. Emergency contact. She'd kept his name. After everything, after the silence, after he let her go, Ethan didn't think. He just moved. And when he arrived at that hospital and saw her lying pale and fragile in a bed that seemed too big for her small frame, he realized something that terrified him. He'd never stopped loving her, and this time, he wasn't going to let her slip away. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is a story about second chances, buried emotions, and a love that refused to die. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room on the 47th floor of Hale Industries. Ethan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as razors. Around him sat 12 of the most powerful executives in New York's financial sector, all waiting for his verdict on a merger that would reshape the entire tech investment landscape. He'd been negotiating this deal for 6 months. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. Reputations would be made or broken based on what happened in the next hour. "The offer is insulting," Ethan said, his voice even and controlled. "We both know the valuation is 30% below market. Either come back with a real number, or we walk." Marcus Chen, the opposing CEO, shifted in his seat. "Mr. Hale, with all due respect, the current market volatility is exactly why you need this deal more than we do." Ethan interrupted smoothly. "Your board is hemorrhaging investor confidence. We're offering you a lifeline. Don't mistake that for desperation on our end." The room fell silent. Marcus exchanged glances with his team, then nodded slowly. "We'll need to caucus." "You have 20 minutes, Ethan said, checking his watch. A Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. As the opposing team filed out, Ethan's CFO, David Park, leaned over. "You're going to make them sweat. They need to understand who holds the leverage," Ethan replied, his tone indicating the conversation was over. David knew better than to push. Everyone did. Ethan Hale was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly unreadable. He'd built Hale Industries from nothing after his parents died when he was 22, leaving him with debt and a name that meant nothing. 12 years later, he was worth over $3 billion, controlled a portfolio of investments that spanned 3 continents, and had a reputation for closing deals that others deemed impossible. He was also completely alone, not that anyone would know it. His life looked perfect from the outside: penthouses, private jets, galas where he was photographed with models and actresses who lasted a few months before quietly disappearing. But Ethan knew the truth. Every success, every achievement, every billion added to his net worth, it all felt hollow. There had been one person who'd made him feel like more than just the sum of his accomplishments, and he'd let her walk away. Ethan stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the glittering city below. The rain blurred the lights into abstract patterns, and for just a moment, his mind drifted somewhere he usually kept locked away. 2 years earlier, late evening, much like this one, he'd been working on a different deal, one just as important, just as consuming. His assistant had knocked softly on his office door. "Mr. Hale, I brought you dinner." Clara Bennett had stood there with a bag from the Italian place 3 blocks over the one he liked, but never had time to visit. She'd remembered. She always remembered. "You didn't have to do that," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "You haven't eaten since breakfast," Clara had replied, setting the bag on his desk. "You can't change the world on an empty stomach." He'd finally looked up then, really looked at her, brown eyes that held more warmth than he deserved, a gentle smile that never demanded anything in return, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, professional but understated. She'd been beautiful in a way that snuck up on you, not obvious or showy, but real. "Thank you, Clara," he'd said. "You're welcome, Mr. Hale." She'd turned to leave, and he'd almost called her back, almost asked her to stay, to eat with him, to talk about something other than quarterly earnings and market projections. But he hadn't, because Ethan Hale didn't do personal, didn't do vulnerable, didn't risk caring about anyone enough that losing them could break him again. The memory dissolved as the conference room door opened and Marcus Chen's team filed back in. Ethan turned from the window, his expression neutral, his walls firmly back in place. "We've discussed your concerns," Marcus said. "We're prepared to increase our offer by 15%. 25, Ethan countered without hesitation. "And that's my final number." The negotiations continued, sharp and tense, but Ethan's mind wasn't fully present. Part of him was still caught in that memory, in the ghost of a smile and the warmth of someone who'd seen him as human. An hour later, the deal was done. Handshakes, terse congratulations, promises to have legal teams finalize paperwork. The opposing team left, and Ethan's own executives began to file out, offering their own congratulations. "Excellent work, Ethan," David said. "This is going to make headlines." "It always does," Ethan replied, already gathering his things. David hesitated. "Are you okay? You seemed distracted." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm fine, just tired." "When was the last time you took a day off?" "I'll take a day off when I'm dead," Ethan said flatly. "Is there anything else?" David knew when he was being dismissed. "No. Have a good night." Ethan watched him leave, then sank back into his chair, alone in the vast conference room. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and the city lights blurred into nothing. His phone sat on the table in front of him, dark and silent. He thought about calling someone, anyone, just to hear another human voice. But who? His parents were gone. He had no siblings. His friendships were transactional, built on business relationships that wouldn't survive a shift in fortune. The women he dated were beautiful and charming and utterly interchangeable. There was no one. Ethan stood, grabbed his phone and briefcase, and headed toward the private elevator that would take him directly to the parking garage. His driver was waiting with the car running, ready to take him back to a penthouse that cost $15 million and felt like a mausoleum. He was about to step into the car when his phone rang. Unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it. He got dozens of calls a day from people he didn't know, investors, reporters, people looking for money or favors. But something made him answer. "Ethan Hale," he said, his tone clipped. "Mr. Hale." The voice was female, professional, calm. "This is Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling because you've been listed as the sole emergency contact for a patient we admitted this evening." Ethan froze, one hand on the car door. "I think you have the wrong number." "I don't." "The patient's name is Clara Bennett," the voice continued. "She was brought in unconscious approximately an hour ago. You're the only contact information we have on file." The world tilted. Clara. Clara Bennett. His Clara. No, not his. Not anymore. Not ever, really. But she'd kept him as her emergency contact. "What happened?" Ethan heard himself ask, his voice suddenly rough. "Is she?" "She's stable," the woman said. "But we need someone here to provide medical history and make decisions if necessary. Can you come to the hospital?" "I'm on my way," Ethan said, already moving. "Which hospital?" "Mercy General, 5th and Lexington. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He ended the call and looked at his driver. "Mercy General, fast." "Yes, sir." Ethan climbed into the back seat, his mind racing. Clara was in the hospital, unconscious, and she'd kept him as her emergency contact even though she'd walked out of his life 2 years ago without looking back. Why? The questions piled up, but underneath them all was a cold, sharp fear that Ethan hadn't felt in years. What if he'd already lost her? What if he never got the chance to tell her the truth he'd been too much of a coward to say when it mattered? The 15-minute drive felt like hours. Ethan stared out the window, watching the rain-soaked streets blur past, and let himself remember all the things he'd tried so hard to forget. Clara had started working for him 3 years before she left. She'd been 26, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in business administration and a resume that was impressive but not exceptional. Ethan had interviewed a dozen candidates for the assistant position, and most of them had been more qualified on paper. But Clara had been different. She'd sat across from him in his office, calm and composed, and when he'd asked her why she wanted the job, she'd given him an answer that had caught him off guard. "Because I'm good at seeing what people need before they ask for it," she'd said simply. "And I think you need someone who won't be intimidated by you." Ethan had raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm intimidating?" "I think you want people to think you're intimidating," Clara had replied, her tone gentle but direct. "But I also think that underneath all of that, you're just someone who works too hard and forgets to take care of himself." No one had ever spoken to him like that. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Clara had done neither. He'd hired her on the spot, and for 3 years, she'd been exactly what she'd promised, someone who anticipated his needs, kept his life running smoothly, and somehow managed to humanize him in small, quiet ways. She'd brought him coffee every morning, always made exactly the way he liked it, even though he'd never told her how. She'd reminded him about birthdays and anniversaries he was supposed to acknowledge, drafting thoughtful messages he'd never have thought to send. She'd worked late when he worked late, never complaining, always efficient. But more than that, she'd talk to him. Really talk to him. Not about business or strategies or deals, but about books and movies and the weather. Small talk that didn't feel small when it came from her. She'd made him laugh. Not often, but when she did, it felt like a gift. And slowly, without him realizing it, Clara Bennett had become the most important person in his life. He'd never told her that, of course. Ethan Hale didn't do feelings, didn't do vulnerability, didn't risk letting anyone close enough to hurt him. So he'd kept her at arm's length, maintaining the professional boundary, even as he'd found himself looking forward to seeing her every morning. Even as he'd started staying late just because she was there. Even as he'd caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, or the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. He'd convinced himself it was nothing, that she was just a good assistant, that he appreciated her competence, nothing more. And then one day, she'd walked into his office and handed him a letter of resignation. "I'm sorry to do this with such short notice," Clara had said, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding his. "But I need to leave. I've found another opportunity." Ethan had stared at the letter, his mind blank. "What opportunity?" "It's personal," Clara had said. I need a change." "Is it the salary?" Ethan had asked, his tone sharper than he'd intended. "I can match whatever they're offering. It's not about money, Mr. Hale." "Then what is it about?" Clara had finally looked at him then, and there had been something in her eyes, something sad and resigned that he hadn't understood. "I just need to find myself," she'd said quietly. "Figure out what I really want." It was a non-answer, and they both knew it. But Ethan hadn't pushed, because pushing would have meant admitting that her leaving mattered, that she mattered, and he couldn't do that. So he'd accepted her resignation with a curt nod and watched her walk out of his office, out of his company, out of his life. He'd told himself it was for the best, that he didn't need anyone, that he was better off alone. But in the 2 years since, his life had felt grayer, emptier. No one brought him coffee anymore. No one reminded him to eat. No one made him laugh. He'd gone through 4 assistants in 2 years, and none of them had lasted more than 6 months. They were all competent, professional, perfectly adequate, but they weren't Clara. Now, sitting in the back of his car as it raced through the rain toward Mercy General Hospital, Ethan finally admitted the truth he'd been running from for 2 years. He'd been in love with Clara Bennett. He'd never told her, never acted on it, never let himself acknowledge it until it was too late. And now she was in a hospital bed, unconscious, and he might never get the chance. The car pulled up to the emergency entrance, and Ethan was out before it had fully stopped. He strode through the automatic doors, his wet shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor, his presence commanding immediate attention. A nurse at the reception desk looked up, startled. "Sir, can I help you?" "Clara Bennett," Ethan said. "I'm her emergency contact. Where is she? The nurse checked her computer. Room 347, third floor. But visiting hours. I don't care about visiting hours, Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. Take me to her, now. The nurse opened her mouth to protest, then thought better of it. Something in Ethan's expression made it clear that arguing would be pointless. Follow me, she said. They took the elevator to the third floor, and Ethan's heart pounded harder with each floor they climbed. What would he find when he saw her? The elevator doors opened, and the nurse led him down a sterile white hallway that smelled of antiseptic and illness. Room 347 was at the end of the hall. The nurse knocked softly, then pushed the door open, and Ethan's world stopped. Clara lay in the hospital bed, small and pale and utterly still. Her brown hair, usually so carefully maintained, was spread across the pillow in tangled waves. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. An IV line ran from her left arm to a bag hanging beside the bed. Monitors beeped softly, tracking vital signs Ethan didn't understand. She looked fragile in a way he'd never seen before. Breakable. Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. What happened to her? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse glanced at the chart. The doctor will need to give you the full details, but from what I understand, she collapsed at work. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition. She's been running herself into the ground. Running herself into the ground. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he stared at Clara's pale face. I'll let Dr. Rodriguez know you're here, the nurse said quietly, then slipped out of the room, leaving Ethan alone with Clara. He stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. This was Clara, the woman who'd always been put together, efficient, in control. The woman who'd taken care of him for 3 years without ever seeming to need anything herself. Now she looked like she'd been fighting a war and losing. Slowly, Ethan moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and took her hand in his. It was cool to the touch, her fingers delicate and worn. He noticed things he'd never seen before. Calluses on her palms, nails cut short and unpolished, the thinness of her wrist, where the hospital bracelet hung loose. These weren't the hands of someone living comfortably. These were the hands of someone working too hard just to survive. What happened to you, Clara? Ethan whispered, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. Where have you been? What have you been doing? She didn't answer, of course, just lay there, breathing softly, unaware that he was even there. Ethan's throat tightened. He thought about the last time he'd seen her 2 years ago, standing in his office, handing him that resignation letter with her eyes downcast, refusing to meet his gaze. He'd been angry then, confused, maybe even hurt, though he'd never admitted it. But he hadn't fought for her, hadn't asked her to stay, hadn't told her that the thought of her leaving felt like losing something essential. He'd just let her go. And now, sitting in this sterile hospital room with machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air, Ethan understood what a coward he'd been. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice rough. I'm so sorry, Clara. I should have. The door opened, and a woman in a white coat entered. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a bun. Mr. Hale? She asked. Ethan stood immediately. Yes. You're Dr. Rodriguez? I am. She glanced at the monitors, checking Clara's vitals with practiced efficiency. I understand you're Miss Bennett's emergency contact? I am, Ethan said, though the words still felt surreal. Can you tell me what happened? Dr. Rodriguez pulled up Clara's chart on a tablet. Miss Bennett was brought in by ambulance after collapsing at her workplace. When she arrived, she was unconscious, severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of extreme exhaustion. Each word hit Ethan like a physical blow. How severe? He asked. Severe enough that if she'd gone much longer without medical intervention, we'd be having a very different conversation, Doctor, Rodriguez said, her tone grave. Her body was essentially shutting down. When was the last time you saw her? 2 years ago, Ethan admitted. She used to work for me. We haven't been in touch. Dr. Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of understanding, maybe judgment. I see. Well, from what we've been able to piece together from her employer and the paramedics, Miss Bennett has been working 3 jobs, waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night, and doing freelance bookkeeping on weekends. 3 jobs. Ethan felt sick. Why? He asked. Why would she need to work 3 jobs? Medical bills, Doctor, Rodriguez said quietly. According to her records, she's been paying off debt from a family member's illness. Her mother passed away about 18 months ago after a long battle with cancer. Ethan's vision blurred. Clara's mother had died. She'd been going through hell for the past 2 years, and he'd had no idea. Because he'd never asked, never reached out, never cared enough to check on her after she left. He'd been so wrapped up in his own wounded pride, in maintaining his walls and his control, that he'd never stopped to think about what Clara might be facing. Is she going to be okay? Ethan managed to ask. Physically, yes, Doctor, Rodriguez said. We've got her on IV fluids and nutrition. She'll need rest, real rest, for at least several weeks. But she's young and otherwise healthy. Her body should recover. And mentally? Dr. Rodriguez's expression softened. That's harder to predict. From what I've seen, Miss Bennett has been operating in crisis mode for a long time, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring her own needs, doing whatever it took to survive. That kind of sustained stress takes a toll that doesn't heal overnight. Ethan looked back at Clara, lying so still and pale in the bed. When will she wake up? He asked. Could be hours, could be tomorrow morning. Her body needs rest, and right now, sleep is the best medicine. Dr. Rodriguez paused, studying Ethan with a perceptive gaze. Mr. Hale, I have to ask, what is your relationship to Miss Bennett? Beyond being her emergency contact? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. What was his relationship to Clara? Former employer? That was true, but felt inadequate. Friend? They'd never been friends, not really. The professional boundary had always been there. The woman he'd been too afraid to love? That was the truest answer, but he couldn't say it out loud. She's someone who mattered to me, Ethan finally said. Someone I failed. Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Well, she's going to need support when she wakes up. Someone to make sure she doesn't go right back to the circumstances that put her here in the first place. She'll have it, Ethan said firmly. Whatever she needs. Good. Dr. Rodriguez made a few notes on her tablet. I'll be back to check on her in a few hours. There's a nurse's station just down the hall if you need anything. She left, and once again, Ethan was alone with Clara. He sat back down, taking her hand again, and for the first time in years, Ethan Hale let himself feel something other than control. He felt fear. Fear that Clara would wake up and tell him to leave. Fear that he'd lost his chance 2 years ago, and there was no getting it back. Fear that even if she gave him another opportunity, he wouldn't know how to be the person she deserved. But underneath the fear was something else. Determination. He'd spent 2 years telling himself he was better off alone, that needing people was a weakness, that maintaining control meant keeping everyone at a distance. But looking at Clara now, at what his absence and indifference had cost her, Ethan understood something fundamental. Control was meaningless if you had no one to share your life with. Success was hollow if you achieved it alone. And walls that kept everyone out also kept you trapped inside. Clara had spent 3 years taking care of him, and he'd never even asked if she needed anything in return. She'd left because she had to, because staying meant loving someone who would never love her back, and he'd been too blind and too scared to see it. But he saw it now, and if she gave him the chance, just one chance, he would spend the rest of his life proving that he could be better, that he could be worthy of the kindness she'd shown him, that he could love her the way she deserved to be loved. Hours passed. The rain continued outside, steady and relentless. The city beyond the hospital windows glowed with lights that blurred into abstract shapes. Ethan didn't move from Clara's side. His phone buzzed repeatedly, David checking in about the merger, his assistant asking about tomorrow's schedule, investors wanting updates. He ignored all of it. For the first time in 12 years, Ethan Hale's entire world had narrowed to a single hospital room and the woman lying in the bed beside him. Around midnight, Clara stirred. It was subtle at first, a slight movement of her fingers, a soft sound in the back of her throat. Ethan leaned forward immediately, his heart racing. "Clara?" he said softly. Her eyelids fluttered. Once, twice. Then slowly, painfully, they opened. For a moment, Clara stared at the ceiling, her expression confused and disoriented. Then her eyes moved, scanning the room until they landed on Ethan. She blinked, as if trying to make sure he was real. "Ethan," her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I'm here," he said, gripping her hand gently. Clara's brow furrowed. Why are you here? Because the hospital called me, Ethan said. I'm still your emergency contact. Confusion flickered across her face, then what looked like embarrassment. I forgot to change it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Don't apologize, Ethan interrupted. Please, just, how are you feeling? Clara tried to sit up, winced, and sank back against the pillows, like I got hit by a truck. The doctor said you collapsed at work. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition. Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the tension underneath. You've been working 3 jobs. Clara's eyes closed. They told you that. They told me about your mother too. Clara, I'm so... Don't. Clara's voice was sharper now. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. Don't say you're sorry. You didn't know because I didn't tell you. We haven't spoken in 2 years. The words stung, but Ethan deserved them. You're right, he said quietly. We haven't. But that doesn't mean I stopped. It doesn't mean I didn't. He trailed off, struggling with words he'd never been good at saying. Clara watched him, her expression guarded. What are you doing here, Ethan? Really? You have a company to run, deals to close, a life that doesn't include me anymore. None of that matters, Ethan said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised even him. Of course it matters. It's who you are. No, Ethan shook his head. It's what I do. It's not who I am. And I'm starting to realize there's a difference. Clara studied him, searching for something in his face. You look tired. Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. That's very Clara of you. I show up at your hospital bed, and you're worried about whether I look tired. Old habits, Clara said, but there was the faintest hint of warmth in her voice. They sat in silence for a moment, the machines beeping softly, the rain still falling outside. Why didn't you tell me about your mother? Ethan asked finally. Clara looked away. Because it wasn't your problem. I didn't work for you anymore. You could have called. I would have helped. I know you would have, Clara said quietly. That's why I didn't call. Ethan frowned. I don't understand. Clara took a slow breath, as if gathering courage. Because I didn't want your help out of obligation, Ethan. I didn't want your money or your connections or your guilt. I just wanted. She stopped, shaking her head. What? Ethan pressed. What did you want? Clara's eyes met his, and in them, Ethan saw pain he'd never noticed before. Pain he'd caused by being too blind to see what was right in front of him. I wanted you to care, she whispered. Not because I worked for you or because it was the decent thing to do. I wanted you to care because I mattered to you. As a person, not as an assistant or an employee or a problem to be solved. The honesty of it hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. And I didn't, he said, the realization crushing. I let you walk away without a fight. You let me walk away without even asking why I was really leaving, Clara corrected gently. Ethan's jaw tightened. Why did you leave, Clara? She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the truth against self-preservation. Finally, she said, because I fell in love with you, and I knew you'd never feel the same way. Staying would have broken me eventually, so I left before it could. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and devastating. Ethan felt like he couldn't breathe. You loved me, he said, his voice barely audible. I did, Clara said. Maybe I still do. I don't know anymore. I've spent 2 years trying not to. Ethan stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair, his control finally cracking. I was such a fool, he said, his voice rough. Such an arrogant, blind fool. Ethan, no, let me say this. He turned to face her, and for the first time, Clara saw real emotion in his eyes. Not the cold control, not the calculated business persona, just raw, honest feeling. You loved me, and I was too much of a coward to admit I loved you too. Clara's breath caught. What? I loved you, Ethan repeated, the words spilling out now like a dam had broken. I've loved you for years, probably since the day you walked into my office and told me I needed someone who wasn't afraid of me. But I convinced myself it was impossible, that I couldn't afford to need anyone, that letting you in would make me weak. He laughed bitterly. So I let you go, and I spent 2 years trying to forget you, trying to convince myself I was better off alone. But I wasn't better. I was emptier. Every day felt grayer without you in it. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now. And then tonight, when the hospital called and said you were here, that you were hurt, Ethan's voice broke. I realized I've been wasting my life, building an empire that means nothing because I have no one to share it with. I don't want to be that man anymore, Clara. I don't want to be alone. He moved back to her bedside, kneeling so he was at her level. I know I don't deserve another chance, he said quietly. I know I failed you in every way that mattered, but if you'll let me, I want to be there for you now. Not as your employer, not out of obligation or guilt, but because I love you. Because you're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm more than just my achievements. Clara stared at him, tears still falling, her expression a mix of hope and fear. How do I know you mean it? She whispered. How do I know this isn't just guilt talking? That you won't wake up tomorrow and realize you made a mistake? It was a fair question, the most fair question she could have asked. Ethan reached up and gently wiped away her tears. Because I'm not leaving, he said simply. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. I'm going to be right here, proving to you every single day that I mean every word. And if it takes months or years for you to believe me, that's fine. I'll wait, because you're worth waiting for. Clara's lower lip trembled. I'm so tired, Ethan, she whispered. I've been tired for so long. I don't know if I have the strength to risk my heart again. Then don't, Ethan said. Don't do anything right now except rest and heal. Let me take care of you the way you took care of me for all those years. No expectations, no pressure. Just let me be here. Clara searched his face, and slowly, almost hesitantly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Stay. Ethan felt something inside him settle something that had been restless and aching for 2 years. I will, he promised. He sat back down in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand. Clara's eyes were already getting heavy again, exhaustion pulling her back towards sleep. Ethan, she murmured. Yeah? Thank you for coming. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, he said honestly. Clara's eyes closed, and within minutes, her breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Ethan sat there, watching her, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on the back of her hand. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city glittered in the darkness, millions of lights marking millions of lives. And in a small hospital room on the 3rd floor of Mercy General, a man who'd spent years building walls finally understood what it meant to let them fall. Have you ever had someone come back into your life when you needed them most? Drop a comment and let us know. And if this story is touching your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Ethan didn't leave Clara's side that night. When the nurses came to check on her at 3 in the morning, they found him still sitting in the chair beside her bed, his hand wrapped around hers, his eyes fixed on her sleeping face. Sir, you should get some rest, the night nurse said gently. There's a waiting room down the hall with more comfortable chairs. I'm fine here, Ethan replied without looking away from Clara. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and left him alone. By the time dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan's neck was stiff and his back ached from the uncomfortable hospital chair. But he didn't care. Clara stirred as sunlight filtered through the blinds, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she'd forgotten where she was. Then her gaze landed on Ethan, and something softened in her expression. You actually stayed, she said, her voice still hoarse. I told you I would, Ethan replied. I thought maybe I dreamed that part. Clara tried to sit up, and this time Ethan helped her, adjusting the pillows behind her back. What time is it? Almost 7. You've been here all night? Yes. Clara shook her head slightly. Ethan, you have a company to run. You can't just... I can, and I did, Ethan interrupted. David is handling things at the office. Everything else can wait. Before Clara could argue, Dr. Rodriguez entered with a tablet in hand and a small smile on her face. Good morning, Miss Bennett. How are you feeling? Better, Clara said. Tired, but better. That's good to hear. Dr. Rodriguez checked the monitors, made a few notes. Your vitals have improved overnight. The fluids and rest are doing their job. When can I leave? Clara asked. Not for a few days at least, Doctor, Rodriguez said firmly. Your body has been through severe trauma. We need to make sure you're stable before we even think about discharge. Clara's face fell. I can't afford to stay here for days. I have jobs. You don't have to worry about that, Ethan said. Clara turned to him sharply. Ethan, no. Clara, yes. His tone left no room for argument. The hospital bills are covered. Your rent is covered. Everything is covered. You just need to focus on getting better. I can't let you do that, Clara protested, her voice rising slightly. I'm not your responsibility. You're right, Ethan said calmly. You're not my responsibility, but you're someone I care about, and I have the resources to help. Let me do this. Clara's jaw tightened. I don't want your charity. It's not charity, Ethan said. It's me trying to make up for 2 years of being an absent, selfish fool. Dr. Rodriguez cleared her throat diplomatically. I'll give you some time to discuss this, but Miss Bennett, I need you to minimize stress. That means no arguing. She left, and silence settled over the room. Clara stared at her hands, her expression conflicted. I don't know how to accept this, Ethan. For 2 years, I've been fighting to stand on my own 2 feet, to prove I didn't need anyone. And you proved it, Ethan said quietly. But needing help doesn't make you weak, Clara. It makes you human, says the man who spent years refusing to need anyone, Clara said. But there was no real heat in her words. Exactly, Ethan agreed. Which is why I know what I'm talking about. Being alone isn't strength, it's just lonely. Clara looked up at him, and for a moment, the guard she'd been holding up wavered. I'm scared, she admitted, of letting you back in, of believing this is real and then having it all fall apart again. Ethan moved his chair closer, taking both of her hands in his. I know, he said, and I don't blame you, but I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not this time. You can test me, push me away, do whatever you need to do to feel safe. I'll still be here. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Why now? After all this time, why now? Because almost losing you made me realize what an idiot I've been, Ethan said simply. I thought I was protecting myself by keeping everyone at a distance, but all I did was waste years I could have spent with you. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek. I wanted you to come after me when I left. I waited for weeks, hoping you'd call or show up or do something that proved I mattered to you. The confession hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough. I'm so sorry, Clara. I was too proud and too scared to admit what you meant to me. And now? Clara asked softly. Now I'm still scared, Ethan admitted. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life without you in it. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know if I can just pick up where we left off, Ethan. Too much has happened. I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. Neither am I, Ethan said. Or at least, I don't want to be. So maybe we don't pick up where we left off. Maybe we start fresh. Take it slow. Let me earn your trust again. Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but I need you to understand something. I can't go back to being your assistant. I can't go back to that dynamic where I take care of you and you barely see me. I don't want that either, Ethan said firmly. I want you to be my equal, my partner, someone I build a life with, not someone who manages my schedule. That's going to be a big change for you, Clara said with a hint of a smile. I'm a fast learner, Ethan replied. For the first time since waking up, Clara laughed, just a small sound, but it made Ethan's heart soar. We'll see about that, she said. Over the next 3 days, Ethan kept his word. He arrived at the hospital every morning at 7 and didn't leave until late at night. He brought Clara books when she complained of boredom, flowers to brighten up the sterile room, and meals from her favorite restaurants when the hospital food proved inedible. But more than that, he talked to her. Really talked. They spoke about things they'd never discussed during the 3 years Clara worked for him. Ethan told her about his childhood, about losing his parents in a car accident when he was 22 and being left with nothing but debt and determination. He told her about the early years of building his company, the failures and near bankruptcies he'd overcome through sheer stubborn will. And Clara told him about her mother's illness, about the slow, painful decline that had drained her savings and left her drowning in medical debt. She told him about working 3 jobs, about the exhaustion that had become so normal she'd forgotten what it felt like to be rested. I kept telling myself it was temporary, Clara said one afternoon as they sat together by the window, that once I paid off the debt, I could slow down. But every time I got close, something else came up. The rent increased, or my car broke down, or I got sick and missed work. You should have called me, Ethan said quietly. And say what? Clara asked. Hey, remember me? The assistant who left without explanation? Can you give me money? That's not who I am, Ethan. You wouldn't have been asking for money, Ethan said. You would have been asking a friend for help. Clara looked at him sadly. We were never friends, Ethan. That was part of the problem. The truth of it stung, but Ethan couldn't deny it. You're right, he said. We weren't, but I want us to be now, if you'll let me. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, Tell me about the last 2 years. What have you been doing besides making more money? Ethan almost laughed at the question. Honestly, nothing. I worked. I closed deals. I expanded the company into 3 new markets, and I came home every night to an empty penthouse and told myself I was successful. Were you happy? Clara asked. Ethan met her eyes. No, I haven't been happy since the day you left. The honesty of the admission hung between them. Clara reached out and touched his hand. I wasn't happy either. I told myself I was doing the right thing, being strong and independent. But mostly I was just lonely. Then maybe we can figure out how to not be lonely together, Ethan said softly. Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Maybe we can. On the 4th day, Dr. Rodriguez cleared Clara for discharge with strict instructions. 2 weeks of complete rest, she said firmly. No work, no stress, just sleep and nutrition and letting your body heal. I'll make sure she follows orders, Ethan said before Clara could protest. Dr. Rodriguez looked between them, then nodded. Good, because if she ends up back here, I'm blaming both of you. When the discharge papers were signed and Clara was dressed in clothes Ethan had brought from her apartment, which he'd visited and been horrified by the cramped, dingy conditions, she stood in the hospital room looking uncertain. Where am I supposed to go? She asked quietly. I can't afford to take 2 weeks off work. You're coming home with me, Ethan said. Clara's eyes widened. Ethan, I can't. You can, and you will, he said firmly. I have a guest room with its own bathroom. You'll have privacy and space and everything you need to rest. This is too much, Clara protested. It's not enough, Ethan countered, but it's a start. Please, Clara, let me do this. Clara looked torn between pride and exhaustion. Finally, exhaustion won. Okay, she said quietly, but just until I'm strong enough to go back to work. We'll see, Ethan said, knowing better than to push. The drive to Ethan's penthouse was quiet. Clara stared out the window at the city passing by, and Ethan could practically see the wheels turning in her head. What are you thinking? He asked. That 2 years ago, I would have given anything to see where you lived, Clara admitted. I used to imagine what your place looked like, whether it was cold and modern or if you had any personal touches. And now? Ethan asked. Now I'm about to find out, Clara said with a small smile. The penthouse was everything Clara had imagined, and nothing like she expected. It was beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows with views of Central Park, modern furniture in shades of grey and white, expensive art on the walls. But it was also completely impersonal. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that suggested an actual human being lived there. It's like a hotel, Clara said, looking around. That's because I basically use it like one, Ethan admitted. I sleep here, shower here, and spend the rest of my time at the office. That's depressing, Clara said bluntly. I know, Ethan agreed. I just never saw the point of making it feel like home when I was the only one here. He led Clara to the guest room, which was larger than her entire apartment had been. It had a king-sized bed, a sitting area, and windows that overlooked the city. This is incredible, Clara breathed. I'll let you rest, Ethan said. If you need anything, I'll be in my office down the hall. Clara caught his hand as he turned to leave. Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for all of this. I know I keep saying I can't accept it, but thank you. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to thank me, Clara. Just rest. The first week was an adjustment for both of them. Clara slept more than she'd slept in 2 years, her body finally able to recover without the constant pressure of work. Ethan worked from home, conducting meetings via video call and handling business from his home office so he could be nearby if Clara needed anything. They fell into a routine. Ethan would check on Clara in the morning, bringing her breakfast in bed despite her protests. They'd have lunch together, often on the terrace overlooking the park. And in the evenings, they'd sit together in the living room, Ethan working on his laptop, while Clara read, both of them simply enjoying the presence of another person. It was domestic in a way Ethan had never experienced, and he loved it. One evening, about a week into Clara's stay, she appeared in the doorway of his office. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course," Ethan said, immediately closing his laptop. "Do you need something?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something," Clara said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Ethan's chest tightened with concern. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Clara said quickly, "but I've been thinking about what happens when I'm fully recovered." "What do you mean?" Clara took a breath. "I mean, I can't stay here forever, Ethan. Eventually, I need to go back to my life, find a job, get my own place." "Why?" Ethan interrupted. Clara blinked. "What do you mean, why?" "Why do you need to leave?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. "You're safe here. You're healing. Why go back to barely surviving when you could?" He stopped himself, realizing how that sounded. But Clara finished the thought for him. "When I could what? Let you take care of me indefinitely? Ethan, that's not a life. That's dependence." "It's not dependence if it's a choice," Ethan argued. "A choice?" Clara's voice rose slightly. "What choice? The choice between accepting your generosity or going back to poverty." "That's not what I meant," Ethan said, frustrated. "Then what did you mean?" Clara asked. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, struggling to articulate what he was feeling. I don't want you to go. I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay. I know I haven't earned that yet, but these past 2 weeks have been the best 2 weeks I've had in years, Clara. Coming home knowing you're here, having someone to talk to share meals with, it's made me realize how empty my life has been." Clara's expression softened. "Ethan, I'm not asking you to be dependent on me," Ethan continued. "I'm asking you to let me be part of your life, to build something together, whatever that looks like." "And what does it look like to you?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan met her eyes. "Honestly, I don't know. I've never done this before, never let anyone this close, but I want to figure it out with you." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I need to be able to take care of myself," she finally said. "It's important to me. I can't be someone who just lives off your wealth." "Then don't," Ethan said. "Work if you want to work. Do something you're passionate about. I'll support whatever you choose, but don't leave just because you think you're supposed to." "Is this about you wanting me here, or about you being afraid to be alone again?" Clara asked, her gaze searching. It was a fair question, maybe even the right question. Ethan considered it carefully before answering. "Maybe it started as fear," he admitted, "but it's not anymore. I want you here because you make everything better. Clara, you make me better, and I want the chance to do the same for you." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You really mean that?" "I do," Ethan said. "Every word." She stood up and walked around the desk, and Ethan stood to meet her. "I'm still scared," Clara whispered. "So am I," Ethan replied. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is," she said. "We'll take it slow," Ethan promised. "As slow as you need." Clara looked up at him, and in her eyes, Ethan saw hope warring with fear. "I don't want to get hurt again," she said softly. "I know," Ethan replied, gently taking her hands in his. "And I can't promise I'll be perfect at this. I've spent so many years keeping people at a distance that I don't even know what healthy closeness looks like. But I promise I'll try, and I promise I won't let you go without a fight this time." Clara took a shaky breath. "What if we try this and it doesn't work? What if we're better as the idea of something than the reality?" "Then at least we'll know," Ethan said, "and we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering what if." Clara studied his face, and Ethan let her see everything, the fear, the hope, the love he'd kept buried for too long. Finally she nodded. "Okay, but I have conditions." "Name them," Ethan said immediately. "First, I need to find work, something I actually want to do, not just something to pay bills. I need purpose beyond just being here." "Agreed," Ethan said. "Whatever you want to do, I'll support it." "Second, I pay rent. Even if it's a fraction of what this place is worth, I need to contribute." Ethan wanted to argue, but he could see how important this was to her. "We can work out something fair," And third, Clara said, her voice softer now, we take this slow. No rushing into anything. No assumptions about where this is going. We figure it out as we go. I can do that, Ethan said. Is there a fourth condition? Clara smiled slightly. Actually, yes. You have to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll tell me when something's wrong, that you won't shut me out or bury yourself in work when things get hard. I can't do this if you're going to disappear emotionally every time you're scared or stressed. Ethan felt the weight of that request. It was asking him to fundamentally change the way he'd operated for most of his adult life. But looking at Clara, at the vulnerability and hope in her eyes, he knew she was right. I promise, he said, and you have to promise me the same thing. No running away when things get complicated. No quitting without giving me a chance to fix things. Clara's breath hitched slightly at the reference to her resignation 2 years earlier. I promise, she said quietly. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, both of them understanding that they were making promises that would require real work to keep. Then Clara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Ethan's waist, resting her head against his chest. Ethan held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her against him, and understood with perfect clarity that this was what home felt like. Not the expensive penthouse or the views or the luxury. This, her. The feeling of holding someone who knew your flaws and chose to stay anyway. Thank you for coming to the hospital, Clara murmured against his chest. For staying, for all of this. Thank you for keeping me as your emergency contact, Ethan replied. For giving me a chance to show up when it mattered. Clara pulled back slightly to look up at him. You know what's funny? What? I almost changed it a dozen times. Every time I filled out new paperwork at a job, I'd stare at that line and tell myself I should put someone else. But I could never bring myself to do it. Why not? Ethan asked. Clara's cheeks flushed slightly. Because some part of me still hoped that if something happened, you'd come, that you'd care enough to show up. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. I will always show up for you, Clara. Always. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a gesture so simple and sweet it made Ethan's heart ache. I'm going to hold you to that, she said. Please do, Ethan replied. Over the next few weeks, things shifted between them in ways both subtle and profound. Clara continued to recover, her strength returning along with the color in her cheeks and the light in her eyes. She started cooking in Ethan's pristine kitchen, which had never been used for anything more than reheating takeout, and Ethan discovered that coming home to the smell of something homemade was better than any restaurant meal. They established routines, morning coffee together on the terrace, evening walks through Central Park, weekends spent exploring the city in ways Ethan never had, despite living there for over a decade. Clara started looking for work, but she was selective this time. She wasn't just looking for a job, she was looking for something that mattered to her. I've been thinking about non-profit work, she told Ethan one evening over dinner. Maybe something focused on helping people dealing with medical debt. I know what that's like, and I want to help others navigate it. That's a great idea, Ethan said, and I might be able to help with connections if you want. Clara raised an eyebrow. You know people in the non-profit world? I know people everywhere, Ethan said with a slight smile, but I'll only make introductions if you want me to. I'm not going to interfere in your job search. I appreciate that, Clara said, though I won't say no to a few names if you have them. Ethan pulled out his phone and started typing. I'll send you some contacts tomorrow. No pressure, just options. Clara smiled at him across the table, and Ethan felt that now familiar warmth spread through his chest. This was what he'd been missing. This easy companionship, this sense of partnership, this feeling that someone actually cared about his day and wanted to share theirs with him. One evening, about a month into Clara's stay, Ethan came home from a rare in-office day to find Clara on the phone in the living room, her voice animated in a way he hadn't heard before. That would be amazing, she was saying. Yes, I can start next week. Thank you so much. She ended the call and turned to find Ethan watching her from the doorway. I got a job, she said, her face lit up with genuine excitement. That's wonderful, Ethan said, meaning it even as a small part of him worried about what this might change. Tell me about it. It's with a non-profit called ClearPath, Clara said, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. They help people navigate medical debt, connect them with resources, advocate for fair billing practices. It's exactly what I wanted to do. That's perfect for you, Ethan said, crossing the room to hug her. I'm so proud of you. Clara hugged him back tightly. They want me to start as a case manager, but there's room for growth. The woman I interviewed with said they're looking for someone to eventually run their patient advocacy program. You'd be incredible at that, Ethan said. Clara pulled back to look at him. You're really okay with this? With me working again? Why wouldn't I be? Ethan asked, genuinely confused. I don't know, Clara said. I guess I worried you might want me to just stay here, not work. Ethan shook his head firmly. Clara, I want you to be happy. If this work makes you happy, then that's what matters. I fell in love with the woman who showed up every day with determination and purpose, not someone who needed to be taken care of. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You just said you fell in love with me. Ethan froze, realizing what he'd said. He could backtrack, claim it was a figure of speech, protect himself the way he always had. But he'd promised Clara honesty. I did, he said quietly. Is that okay? Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. Yeah, it's okay, because I'm pretty sure I never stopped loving you. Ethan felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Really? Really? Clara confirmed. I tried. I spent 2 years trying to get over you, but then you showed up at that hospital, and all those walls I'd built just crumbled. Ethan cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. I don't want to mess this up, Clara. I don't want to hurt you again. Then don't, Clara said simply. Just be here. Be honest. Be the man I see right now, not the one who hid behind boardrooms and balance sheets. I can do that, Ethan said. Promise? Clara asked. Promise, Ethan replied. And then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid the moment might shatter. But then Clara's arms wrapped around his neck and Ethan pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily. I've wanted to do that for about 4 years, Ethan admitted. Clara laughed, the sound light and happy. Why didn't you? Because I was an idiot, Ethan said. Well, at least you're a self-aware idiot now, Clara teased. Ethan pulled her close again, resting his forehead against hers. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the time we wasted. That's a pretty big promise, Clara said softly. I know, Ethan replied, but I mean it. Every word. The next few months were a revelation for both of them. Clara threw herself into her new job with passion and dedication. She came home with stories about the people she was helping, frustrated by the injustices she was fighting against, but energized by the small victories. Ethan found himself restructuring his own work life to accommodate having someone to come home to. He delegated more, left the office at reasonable hours, and discovered that the company didn't actually fall apart without his constant presence. They had their first real argument about 3 months in, when Clara found out Ethan had donated a significant sum to Clear Path without telling her. You can't just throw money at my workplace, Clara said, her voice tight with frustration. Do you know how that looks? People are going to think I only got the job because of you. You got the job because you're qualified and passionate, Ethan argued. My donation has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with that, Clara shot back. You're my partner, Ethan. You can't make decisions that affect my professional life without talking to me first. Ethan had been about to argue further when he remembered his promise. No shutting down, no retreating behind walls. You're right, he said instead. I should have talked to you first. I was trying to help, but I didn't think about how it would affect you. I'm sorry. Clara had blinked, clearly surprised by the apology. Oh, okay. Thank you. I mean it, Ethan said. I overstepped. It won't happen again. They'd talked it through, established better communication boundaries, and by the end of the conversation, they were both clearer on what the other needed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, Ethan was learning, was so much better than perfect. One Saturday morning, 6 months after Clara had moved in, Ethan woke to find her side of the bed empty. They'd been sharing a bed for about 2 months now, a gradual transition that had felt natural and right. He found her on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise over Central Park. Couldn't sleep? He asked, settling beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. Just thinking, Clara said, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. About what? Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, about how different my life is now compared to a year ago. This time last year, I was working myself to death, barely scraping by, convinced that was just how life was going to be forever. And now? Ethan asked. Now I have work I love, a home I feel safe in, and someone who actually sees me, Clara said. She looked at him, her eyes bright. You saved me, Ethan. Ethan shook his head. You saved yourself. I just showed up when you needed someone. You showed up when I'd given up hope that anyone would, Clara corrected gently. That matters. Ethan set down his coffee and took her hand. I need to tell you something. Clara's expression grew concerned. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Ethan said quickly, but I've been thinking about something, and I want to run it by you before I make any decisions. Okay, Clara said cautiously. I want to start a foundation, Ethan said, focused on medical debt relief and support for people in situations like yours. I've been talking to advisors about the best way to structure it, and I want you to be part of it, not just as inspiration, but as a co-founder, someone who understands the problem from the inside. Clara stared at him. Ethan, that's huge. I know, he said, and I know we've talked about keeping our professional lives separate, but this would be something we build together, something that actually matters. What about your company? Clara asked. I'm stepping back, Ethan said. Not completely, but I'm promoting David to CEO. I'll stay on as chairman, but I don't need to be running day-to-day operations anymore. I want to do something that actually helps people, Clara, and I want to do it with you. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. You'd really do that? Step back from everything you built? I built an empire to prove I mattered, Ethan said, but I already matter to you, and that's worth more than all the money and power in the world. Clara set down her coffee and moved into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. I love you, she said fiercely. I love you so much. I love you too, Ethan replied, holding her close. So is that a yes? Clara pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Yes, it's a yes to everything. Ethan kissed her, tasting salt from her tears, feeling her love in every touch. And as the sun rose over the city, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, Ethan understood something fundamental. He'd spent years building walls to protect himself from loss, but the only thing those walls had protected was his loneliness. Clara had torn them down, brick by brick, with her kindness and her patience and her refusal to let him hide from what he really needed. And now, holding her in the morning light, Ethan finally felt like he'd come home. If this story is touching your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because the ending is going to be beautiful. 1 year after that phone call that changed everything, Ethan stood in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, watching Clara work the room. She wore a deep blue dress that made her eyes shine, her hair swept up elegantly, and she moved through the crowd with a confidence that still took his breath away. She was in her element, talking to donors and advocates and patients whose lives had been changed by the foundation they'd built together. The Bennett Hale Foundation for Medical Advocacy had launched 6 months earlier, and tonight was their first major fundraising gala. Ethan had wanted to call it the Clara Bennett Foundation, but she'd insisted on both their names. We built this together, she'd said firmly, and I want the world to know that. Now, watching her laugh with a group of donors, explaining their latest initiative with passion and expertise, Ethan felt pride swell in his chest. This was the woman he'd almost lost. The woman who'd almost worked herself to death because she had no one to help her carry the weight. And now she was helping hundreds of others carry theirs. You look like a man in love, David said, appearing at Ethan's elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. That's because I am, Ethan replied, accepting the glass. It's good to see, David said. I have to admit, when you first told me you were stepping back from the company, I thought you'd lost your mind. I probably did, Ethan said with a slight smile, but it was the best decision I ever made. The company's doing fine, you know, David said. Actually better than fine. We're up 17% this quarter. I know, Ethan said. You send me the reports. Which you probably don't read, David teased. I skim them, Ethan admitted, but my focus is elsewhere now. No regrets? David asked. Ethan looked across the room at Clara, who was now talking to a young woman in a wheelchair. listening intently to whatever she was saying. "Not a single one," Ethan said. Clara caught his eye from across the room and smiled. A private smile meant just for him. Ethan's heart did that thing it always did when she looked at him like that. It felt too big for his chest, like it might burst with the simple joy of being seen by her. "I need to go steal my girlfriend for a dance," Ethan said. "Girlfriend?" David raised an eyebrow. "I thought by now you'd have made it official." "Soon," Ethan said, patting the small box in his jacket pocket. "Very soon." The gala was a success beyond their expectations. They raised over $2 million in a single night, enough to expand their services to 3 more cities and hire additional case managers. But for Ethan, the real success was watching Clara shine. She'd given a speech that had left half the room in tears, talking about her own experience with medical debt and the crushing weight of trying to survive while grieving. She'd spoken about her mother with such love and pain that Ethan had felt his own eyes burning. And then she'd talked about hope, about second chances, about the power of having someone show up when you need them most. "We named this foundation Bennett Hale," Clara had said, her voice strong and clear, "because it represents what happens when 2 broken people decide to build something whole together. When someone who's been through hell decides to make sure others don't have to walk that path alone. And when someone who spent years building walls finally tears them down." She'd looked directly at Ethan when she said that last part, and the entire room had turned to look at him too. Ethan had simply raised his glass to her, his heart in his throat. Now, as the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out, Ethan found Clara on the terrace overlooking Central Park South, the city lights glittering below. "There you are," he said, sliding his jacket around her shoulders. "You disappeared." "Just needed a moment," Clara said, leaning back against him as his arms wrapped around her waist. "It's been an incredible night." "You were incredible," Ethan corrected. "That speech, Clara, there wasn't a dry eye in the room." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "Public speaking still makes me want to hide under a table." "You'd never know it," Ethan said. "You were confident and powerful and absolutely perfect." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "We make a good team, don't we?" "The best team," Ethan agreed. Clara studied his face, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've been acting strange all evening. Nervous, almost. What's going on?" "Can't I just be proud of you?" Ethan asked. "You can," Clara said. "But there's something else. I can tell." Ethan had planned to wait, to take her somewhere romantic, maybe back to the hospital where it all started, or the terrace of his penthouse where they'd had so many important conversations. But standing here, with the city spread out below them, and Clara looking at him with those warm brown eyes that saw through every defense he'd ever built, Ethan realized the moment was already perfect. "You're right," he said. "There is something else." He stepped back slightly, and Clara's eyes widened as he reached into his jacket pocket. "Ethan," she started. "Let me say this first," Ethan interrupted gently, pulling out the small velvet box. "A year ago, I got a phone call that changed my life. When the hospital told me you were hurt, that you'd collapsed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, genuine fear. Not of losing money or power or success, but of losing you, the person who'd made me feel human again." He opened the box, revealing a ring that had taken him 3 months to design, a sapphire, the exact color of Clara's dress, the first night they'd spent together after she came home from the hospital, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like stars. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "I spent so many years convinced that loving someone made you weak," Ethan continued, his own voice rough with emotion. "That needing anyone was dangerous. But you taught me that the opposite is true. That love isn't weakness, it's the only thing that makes us truly strong." He dropped to one knee, and Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Clara Bennett, you saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving. You saw past the money and the power to the lonely man underneath, and you loved him anyway. You've made me want to be better, to do better, to build something that actually matters, and I want to spend the rest of my life being the man you deserve." Ethan took a breath, his heart pounding. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Clara just stared at him, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. Then she dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her hands. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. Ethan laughed in pure relief and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like everything about them had finally aligned. Clara threw her arms around his neck, and they stayed there on their knees on the terrace, holding each other and crying and laughing all at once. "I love you," Clara whispered against his neck. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "Good," Ethan said, pulling back to look at her, "because I love you the same way. The kind of love that's bigger than fear, bigger than doubt, bigger than anything I've ever felt before." Clara kissed him then, deep and passionate and full of promise, and Ethan felt the last piece of the wall around his heart crumble to dust. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Clara looked down at the ring on her finger, turning her hand to watch it catch the light. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said. "It's a sapphire," Ethan said. "The same color as the dress you wore that first night I brought you home from the hospital. The night I realized I couldn't live without you anymore." Fresh tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. "You remembered what I was wearing?" "I remember everything about you," Ethan said simply. Clara laughed through her tears. "We're getting married." "We're getting married," Ethan confirmed, still hardly believing it himself. "My mother would have loved you," Clara said softly, a bittersweet smile on her face. "She always wanted me to find someone who saw me, really saw me. She would have been so happy." "I wish I could have met her," Ethan said. "I wish I could have thanked her for raising such an incredible daughter." "She knew," Clara said. "Before she died, I told her about you, about how I'd worked for this amazing, complicated man who made me want to be better at everything I did. She told me that if he was smart, he'd realize what he had before it was too late." "She was right," Ethan said. "I almost did let it be too late." "But you didn't," Clara said, touching his face gently. "You showed up when it mattered, and you kept showing up every day after that." They stayed on the terrace for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future they would build together. A wedding small and intimate, Clara decided. Nothing like the corporate events they both had to attend regularly. A home, maybe not the penthouse, which still felt more like a showpiece than a sanctuary. Something with character, Clara suggested. Room for a family someday. That thought made Ethan's heart skip. A family. Children who would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, who would never feel the loneliness he'd felt growing up. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, noticing his expression. "About the future," Ethan admitted. "About building a life with you, maybe having kids someday." Clara's eyes softened. "You want children?" "I want everything with you," Ethan said. "Everything I never let myself want before." "Me too," Clara whispered. They set the wedding date for 6 months later, enough time to plan, but not so far away that Ethan had to wait an eternity to call Clara his wife. The engagement made news, of course. Business magazines ran articles about the reclusive billionaire CEO who'd stepped back from his empire for love. Society columns speculated about the wedding, trying to guess if it would be the event of the season. But Ethan and Clara ignored most of it. They were too busy with the foundation, which was growing faster than either of them had anticipated. The gala had brought not just money but attention, and suddenly they were being contacted by hospitals, advocacy groups, and individuals across the country asking for help or wanting to partner. Clara threw herself into the work with renewed purpose, and Ethan supported her in every way he could, using his business connections to open doors, his experience to help scale the organization efficiently, and his presence to remind her to rest when she started pushing too hard. "I'm not going to let you work yourself into the ground again," he'd told her one evening when he found her still at her desk at 10 o'clock. "I'm fine," Clara had protested. "That's what you said last time," Ethan had replied, gently closing her laptop. "Come to bed. The work will be there tomorrow." "You're one to talk about working too much," Clara had pointed out. "Which is exactly why I know the warning signs," Ethan had said. "Come on, let me take care of you." Clara had let him lead her away from the desk, and they'd fallen asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the city lights casting soft shadows across their bedroom. These were the moments Ethan treasured most, not the galas or the press coverage or the success of the foundation, but the quiet, intimate moments when it was just the two of them, building a life, one day at a time. 2 months before the wedding, Clara's aunt called with unexpected news. Clara's mother had left behind some boxes that had been in storage, things her aunt had only just gotten around to sorting through. Among them were letters, dozens of letters that Clara's mother had written but never sent. Clara drove upstate to collect them, and Ethan went with her, sensing that she needed support, even if she didn't ask for it. Her aunt's house was small and warm, filled with the smell of baking and memories. She welcomed them both with tight hugs and tears in her eyes. "You look happy, sweetheart," she said to Clara. "Your mother would be so proud." "I wish she could be here," Clara said, her voice tight. "She is," her aunt said, touching Clara's heart gently. "Right here, always." She led them to a small room where several boxes sat waiting. "Take your time," her aunt said. "I'll make us some coffee." Alone in the room, Clara stared at the boxes with an expression that broke Ethan's heart. "Do you want me to give you some privacy?" he asked. Clara shook her head and reached for his hand. "No, stay, please." They sat together on the floor, and Clara opened the first box. Inside were letters, carefully labeled with dates. Clara picked up the one on top, dated just 3 months before her mother's death. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read aloud. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I want you to know that every moment I had with you was a gift. Watching you grow from that curious little girl into the strong, compassionate woman you've become has been the greatest joy of my life." Clara's voice broke, and Ethan squeezed her hand gently. She continued reading. "I know you blame yourself for my illness, for the debt, for all of it. But sweetheart, you have nothing to feel guilty about. You gave me the best care any daughter could give. You sacrificed so much, and I only wish I could have spared you that burden." Tears streamed down Clara's face, and Ethan pulled her against his chest, holding her as she cried. After a moment, Clara pulled back and kept reading. "I want you to promise me something, Clara. Promise me you won't spend your life alone because you're afraid of burdening someone else. You deserve love, real love, the kind that makes you better and stronger. You deserve someone who sees you for the amazing person you are." Clara looked up at Ethan, her eyes red but shining. "And I have a feeling you already know who that someone is," the letter continued. "That man you told me about, Ethan, the one who makes you want to be your best self. If he's smart, he'll realize what he has in you. And if he doesn't, then he doesn't deserve you. But something tells me he will. Something tells me you two are meant to find your way to each other." Clara let out a sob that was half laugh. She knew. Even then, she knew. "She was a wise woman," Ethan said softly. Clara read the last paragraph through her tears. "Live, my darling girl. Live fully and love deeply, and don't be afraid of being happy. You've earned it 1,000 times over. I love you to the stars and back. Always and forever, Mom." Clara folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart, crying quietly while Ethan held her. They spent the next hour going through the boxes together, finding more letters, photographs, mementos from Clara's childhood. Each one was a gift, a piece of her mother she'd thought was lost forever. When they finally left her aunt's house, carrying several boxes to take home, Clara was quiet in the car. Ethan drove one-handed, the other holding hers across the console. "Thank you for coming with me," Clara finally said. "Always," Ethan replied. "My mom was right, you know," Clara said, "about everything, about living fully, about loving deeply, about you." "She sounds like she was an incredible woman," Ethan said. "She was," Clara agreed. "And I think she'd really like you. Maybe not at first, she'd probably give you a hard time for letting me go 2 years ago, but eventually she'd see what I see." "Which is?" Ethan asked. "A good man who's learning how to be great," Clara said simply. Ethan brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I'm only as good as the woman who loves me makes me want to be," he said. The wedding took place on a perfect spring day in a small garden venue in Westchester. True to Clara's wishes, it was intimate, just 50 people, all of whom actually mattered to them. David served as Ethan's best man. Clara's aunt walked her down the aisle, and the entire staff of the foundation attended, along with several of the patients they'd helped. Clara wore a simple ivory dress that took Ethan's breath away when he saw her walking toward him. Her hair was loose in soft waves, adorned with small white flowers that matched the wildflower bouquet she carried. She looked radiant, glowing with happiness that seemed to light her from within. But it was her eyes that undid him completely. As she walked down the aisle, she never looked away from him, and in her gaze, Ethan saw everything: love, trust, hope, and the promise of a future they would build together. When she reached him, her aunt kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Ethan's. "Take care of my girl," her aunt whispered. "With my life," Ethan promised. The ceremony was officiated by the director of Clear Path, the non-profit where Clara had first found work after leaving the hospital. She was a warm woman in her 60s named Patricia, who'd become a mentor and friend to Clara over the past year. "We are gathered here today," Patricia began, her voice carrying across the garden, "to witness the joining of two people who found each other in the most unexpected way. Their story isn't a fairy tale about a prince rescuing a princess. It's something better. It's about two broken people who chose to heal together." She looked at Ethan and Clara with affection. Ethan and Clara have both known loss and loneliness. They've both spent years building walls to protect themselves from being hurt. But they've also learned something that many people never do, that true strength isn't found in isolation, but in having the courage to let someone see your vulnerabilities. Patricia smiled. The love we're celebrating today wasn't built on grand gestures or sweeping romance, though there's been plenty of both. It was built on showing up, on choosing each other every single day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Ethan felt Clara's hand tighten in his, and he squeezed back gently. "And now," Patricia said, "they'd like to share the vows they've written for each other." "Ethan?" Ethan took a breath, pulling out the paper he'd folded in his pocket. He'd rewritten these vows a dozen times, trying to find the perfect words. In the end, he'd simply written the truth. "Clara," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "A year and a half ago, I thought I had everything. Success, wealth, power, all the things I'd convinced myself mattered. But I was empty inside, and I didn't even realize it until the hospital called to tell me you were hurt." He paused, his eyes locked on hers. "That phone call was the moment everything changed. It forced me to confront something I'd been running from for years, that I'd been in love with you almost from the day we met, but I was too afraid to admit it. Afraid that needing you made me weak. Afraid that loving you would give you the power to destroy me." Clara's eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling. "I was wrong about everything," Ethan continued. "Loving you doesn't make me weak, it makes me braver than I've ever been. Needing you doesn't diminish me, it completes me. And giving you my heart isn't giving you the power to destroy me, it's giving you the power to make me whole." His voice grew stronger. "I promise to show up for you every single day, in every way that matters. I promise to see you, really see you, the way you've always seen me. I promise to build a life with you that's based on honesty, partnership, and unwavering support. And I promise to love you fiercely, completely, and without reservation, for the rest of my life." By the time he finished, there were tears streaming down Clara's face, and Ethan had to blink back his own. Patricia handed Clara a tissue, and the guests laughed softly as she dabbed her eyes. "Your turn," Patricia said gently. Clara took a shaky breath and looked down at her own folded paper. Then she looked back up at Ethan and slowly tore the paper in half. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly, and Clara smiled. "I wrote beautiful vows," she said, "poetic ones. But standing here looking at you, all those carefully chosen words feel inadequate." She took both of his hands in hers. "Ethan, you came into my life when I needed stability, and you gave me that. But what I didn't know I needed even more was someone who would see past the efficient, capable assistant to the scared, lonely woman underneath." Her voice was thick with emotion but clear. "For 3 years, I loved you from a distance, telling myself it was enough just to be near you. But it wasn't enough, and leaving broke my heart. I spent 2 years trying to convince myself I'd made the right choice, that I was better off without you." Clara smiled through her tears. "And then you showed up at that hospital room, and I saw something in your eyes I'd never seen before, fear, real, raw fear. And I realized that maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't been alone in my feelings after all." She squeezed his hands. "You've spent this past year proving to me that love isn't about perfect gestures or grand declarations. It's about showing up, day after day, especially when things are hard. It's about building something real together, brick by brick, choice by choice." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I promise to be your partner in everything, your equal, your supporter, your biggest champion. I promise to call you out when you start building walls again, and to let you call me out when I do the same. I promise to build the foundation with you, build our home with you, build our family with you, and I promise to love you not just in the easy moments, but especially in the hard ones, because that's when love matters most." Ethan's vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide. Patricia had to clear her throat before she could continue. "By the power vested in me," she said, her own voice thick with emotion, "and in the presence of these witnesses who love you both, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, kiss your bride." Ethan pulled Clara close and kissed her with everything he had, all the love he'd kept buried for years, all the gratitude for her patience and grace, all the hope for the future they would build together. The guests erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at once. "I love you, Mrs. Hale," Ethan whispered. "I love you too, Mr. Hale," Clara replied. Hand in hand, they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, ready to begin the next chapter of their story. The reception was everything a wedding should be, full of laughter, dancing, terrible speeches that made everyone cry, and love so thick you could almost touch it. David gave a speech about how Ethan had been insufferable before Clara came into his life, and how she'd performed a miracle by making him human again. Clara's aunt spoke about watching Clara transform from a heartbroken young woman into someone who glowed with happiness. And Patricia told the story of Clara's first day at Clear Path, how she'd been quiet and uncertain, but had thrown herself into the work with such passion that everyone knew she was special. And then one day, Patricia said, Clara brought someone to tour our facilities, a tall, serious man in an expensive suit who I assumed was a potential donor. But the way he looked at Clara like she hung the moon, I knew immediately who he was, and I knew Clara was going to be just fine. As the evening progressed and the sun set over the garden, Ethan found himself on the dance floor with Clara, swaying to a song she'd chosen, an old jazz standard about love that endures. "Happy?" he asked, the question that had become their ritual. "Deliriously," Clara replied. "You? More than I ever thought possible," Ethan said honestly. Clara rested her head against his chest, and they moved together in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The foundation is growing fast. We're going to need more space soon." "We can look for a bigger office," Ethan said. "I was thinking something more permanent," Clara said, pulling back to look at him. "What if we bought a building, dedicated it entirely to the work, created a real center where people could come for help, resources, support groups, everything in one place?" Ethan's mind was already racing with possibilities. "That's brilliant. We could set up partnerships with hospitals, have legal advisors on staff to help people navigate billing disputes, maybe even offer temporary financial assistance for people in crisis." Clara's face lit up. "Exactly. And we could name it after my mother, the Eleanor Bennett Center for Medical Advocacy." Ethan's heart swelled. "Clara, that's perfect. She would be so proud." "You think so?" Clara asked, suddenly vulnerable. "I know so," Ethan said firmly, "and I'm going to make sure we build something worthy of her memory." Clara kissed him softly. "We're going to change lives, Ethan. Really change them." "We already are," Ethan said. "But yes, we're going to change so many more." 3 months after the wedding, they found the perfect building, a beautiful old brownstone in Midtown Manhattan that had once been a community center. It needed renovations, but the bones were solid and the location was ideal. Ethan used his business connections to expedite the purchase and hire the best contractors. Clara worked with the foundation team to design the space, creating areas for private consultations, group meetings, legal services, and even a small library of resources. The renovation took 6 months, and both Ethan and Clara were involved in every decision. They spent evenings poring over blueprints, weekends visiting the construction site, and late nights dreaming about what the center would become. On the day they opened the Eleanor Bennett Center for Medical Advocacy, over 200 people showed up. Patients they'd helped, donors who'd supported them, media covering the story, and community members who'd heard about the work they were doing. Clara stood in the main lobby, staring at the bronze plaque they'd mounted on the wall. The Eleanor Bennett Center for Medical Advocacy, founded in loving memory of Eleanor Marie Bennett, a woman who taught her daughter that compassion is the greatest strength and that helping others is the highest calling. May all who enter here find the help, hope, and healing she would have wanted for them. Ethan came to stand beside her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "She would love this," he said quietly. "I hope so," Clara whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. I really hope so. The doors opened and people began to stream in. Clara pulled herself together and moved into the crowd, greeting people with warmth and grace. Ethan watched her work the room, saw the way she listened to each person like they were the only one there, saw the way she made everyone feel seen and valued. This was the woman he'd almost let walk out of his life, the woman he'd been too blind to see, too afraid to love. Now she was his wife, his partner, his entire world. And together, they were building something that would outlast both of them, a legacy of compassion and care that would help thousands of people for years to come. That evening, after the last guest had left and the center had been locked up for the night, Ethan and Clara stood in the empty lobby, exhausted but exhilarated. We did it, Clara said, looking around in wonder. We actually did it. You did it, Ethan corrected. This was your vision. Our vision, Clara said firmly. None of this would exist without you. Ethan pulled her close. I think your mother would disagree. I think she'd say this existed the moment you decided to turn your pain into purpose. Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for everything, for showing up when I needed you, for loving me when I was too scared to believe in it, for building this with me. Thank you for not giving up on me, Ethan replied, for seeing something worth saving when I'd convinced myself I was better off alone. They stood there in the quiet lobby, holding each other, surrounded by the physical manifestation of their love and their commitment to helping others. I have something to tell you, Clara said after a moment, her voice nervous and excited all at once. Ethan pulled back to look at her. What is it? Clara took a deep breath, then placed Ethan's hand on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby, she said softly. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only stare at Clara as the words sank in. A baby. They were going to have a baby. Are you sure? He finally managed to ask. I found out this morning, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to wait until after the opening to tell you, but I couldn't keep it in anymore. Ethan dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against Clara's stomach, overwhelmed with emotion. We're going to have a baby, he repeated, his voice breaking. We're going to have a baby, Clara confirmed, running her fingers through his hair. Ethan looked up at her, tears streaming down his own face. I'm going to be a father. The best father, Clara said with certainty, because you know what it's like to grow up without parents. You know how important it is to show up, to be present, to love unconditionally. Ethan stood and pulled Clara into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because she was. She was his home, his heart, his entire reason for being. I love you, he said fiercely. I love you so much, Clara. I love you too, Clara replied. And I can't wait to meet our baby, to build a family with you, to watch you be the father I know you're going to be. They stayed there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the legacy they'd built in honor of the past and the future they were creating together. 9 months later, Eleanor Patricia Hale came into the world at exactly 3:42 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with a healthy set of lungs and her mother's eyes. Ethan had never cried as much as he did the moment the nurse placed his daughter in his arms. She was so small, so perfect, so utterly dependent on him and Clara to protect her and love her and give her the life she deserved. Hello, Ellie, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm your dad, and I promise you, every single day of your life, you're going to know you're loved. Clara watched from the hospital bed, exhausted but glowing, tears of joy streaming down her face. She's perfect, Clara said. She's a miracle, Ethan corrected, bringing the baby to Clara so she could hold her. As Clara cradled their daughter, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed beside them, his arm around Clara, his hand gently touching Ellie's tiny fingers. This was his family. This was what all the success, all the money, all the power had been missing. Connection, love, purpose beyond profit. Thank you, Ethan said quietly. For what? Clara asked, looking up at him. For not giving up on me, Ethan said. For keeping me as your emergency contact, even when you had every reason not to. For giving me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. For building this beautiful life with me. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. You would have done the same for me. I hope so, Ethan said. I really hope so. Little Ellie yawned, her tiny face scrunching up in a way that made both her parents laugh through their tears. "Welcome to the world, baby girl," Clara whispered. "You're going to be so loved." And she was. 5 years later, the Hale family had grown to include not just Ellie, but her younger brother, Thomas David Hale, who'd arrived 2 years after his sister, with the same dramatic timing at 3 in the morning. The Eleanor Bennett Center had expanded to 5 locations across 3 states, helping over 10,000 families navigate medical debt and advocacy every year. Ethan had completely stepped away from day-to-day operations at Hale Industries, serving only as chairman and using his business acumen to help grow the foundation instead. And Clara had written a book about her experience, a memoir about medical debt, grief, resilience, and second chances that had become a bestseller and brought even more attention to the cause. But on this particular Saturday morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Ethan was in the kitchen of their brownstone in Brooklyn. They'd moved out of the penthouse 3 years earlier, trading glass and steel for exposed brick, and a backyard making pancakes while chaos erupted around him. 5-year-old Ellie was at the table, covered in marker, creating what she insisted was a very important picture for Daddy's office. 2-year-old Tommy was banging a wooden spoon against a pot, conducting an orchestra only he could hear, and Clara was laughing at all of it from the doorway, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of Ethan's old t-shirts and looking absolutely beautiful. "You're supposed to be resting," Ethan said, pointing the spatula at her. "Saturday mornings are my shift, remember?" "I rested," Clara protested, "for a whole extra hour, but I heard the chaos and couldn't resist." "Mommy!" Ellie jumped up and ran over, waving her marker-covered hands. "Look what I made!" Clara knelt down, examining the drawing with the same serious attention she gave to foundation proposals. "Is this our family?" "Yes," Ellie said proudly. "That's you and Daddy and me and Tommy and the new baby." Clara's eyes met Ethan's over Ellie's head, and they shared a secret smile. They hadn't told the children yet that Clara was pregnant again only 8 weeks along, still early, but somehow Ellie had sensed it anyway. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Clara said, hugging her daughter. "Daddy should definitely hang it in his office." "Right next to all the other important documents," Ethan agreed solemnly. Tommy abandoned his pot drumming and toddled over, demanding to be picked up. Ethan scooped him up with one arm while flipping pancakes with the other, a skill he'd mastered through necessity. "Pancake," Tommy declared, pointing at the griddle. "Yes, buddy, pancakes are coming," Ethan promised. Clara watched this scene, her husband juggling their toddler and breakfast, while their daughter chattered about her drawing, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. This was the life she'd dreamed of during those dark days of working 3 jobs and barely surviving. The life she'd thought was impossible when she'd left Ethan's office 2 years before that hospital call. Family, home, love, that was messy and loud and absolutely perfect. Breakfast was served family style at their big kitchen table, a far cry from the sleek, unused dining room in the penthouse. Pancakes were eaten, syrup was spilled. Tommy got more food on himself than in himself, and Ellie told elaborate stories about her imaginary friend who lived in the garden. It was beautifully ordinary, and Ethan cherished every moment of it. After breakfast, while Clara supervised bath time for the sticky children, Ethan's phone rang. It was David. "Sorry to bother you on a Saturday," David said, "but I thought you'd want to know the Tokyo merger just went through. We're officially international now." "That's great," Ethan said, and he meant it. He was still proud of the company he'd built, still cared about its success. "Congratulations. You've done an incredible job as CEO." "Thanks," David said. "You know, 5 years ago, when you told me you were stepping back, I thought you'd regret it, that you'd miss the rush of closing big deals." "Do I sound like I regret it?" Ethan asked, as the sound of children's laughter echoed from upstairs. David laughed. "Not even a little bit. You sound happy, Ethan. Really, genuinely happy." "I am," Ethan said simply. After the call ended, Ethan went upstairs to find Clara had corralled both children into the bathroom. Ellie was playing with bath toys while Clara washed Tommy, who was trying to eat bubbles. "Everything okay?" Clara asked, noticing Ethan in the doorway. "Everything's perfect," Ethan said. "That was David. The Tokyo merger went through." "That's wonderful," Clara said. "Are you okay with it? Not being the one who closed it?" Ethan thought about it honestly. 5 years ago, missing a deal like that would have killed him. His entire identity had been wrapped up in those wins, those moments of triumph. Now, I'm great with it, he said. I'd much rather be here, watching our son eat bubbles and our daughter conduct a symphony with rubber ducks. Clara smiled at him, that warm, knowing smile that still made his heart skip. You've come a long way, Ethan Hale. We both have, Ethan said, kneeling beside the bathtub to help wrangle Tommy, who'd discovered that splashing was the most fun game ever invented. That afternoon, they took the kids to Central Park. Ellie ran ahead to the playground while Ethan pushed Tommy in the stroller, and Clara walked beside them, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow. Do you ever think about that night? Clara asked quietly. When the hospital called? All the time, Ethan admitted. That call changed everything. I think about it too, Clara said, about how scared I was when I woke up and saw you there, about how I didn't trust it at first. Can you blame yourself? Ethan asked. I'd given you no reason to trust that I'd actually changed. But you had changed, Clara said. Or maybe you just finally let me see who you really were underneath all those walls. They reached the playground, and Ethan parked the stroller in the shade, while Tommy fought to be let out. The moment his feet hit the ground, he took off toward the sandbox with single-minded determination. Ellie was already at the top of the slide, waving at them. Daddy, Mummy, watch me. They watched her slide down, clapping and cheering, and Ellie beamed with pride before immediately climbing back up to do it again. I love this, Clara said softly. This life we've built, this family. Me too, Ethan said, wrapping his arm around her waist. Though I have to admit, when we have 3 kids under 6, I might have a moment of panic. Clara laughed. Just one moment? Okay, maybe several moments, Ethan conceded. But good panic, the kind that means your life is full and messy and real. Speaking of which, Clara said, I have something else to tell you. Ethan's eyebrows rose. Besides the pregnancy? The foundation board wants to expand again, Clara said. They're proposing 3 new centers, one in Chicago, one in Atlanta, and one in Los Angeles. It would triple our reach. That's incredible, Ethan said. What do you think? I think it's what my mother would have wanted, Clara said, to help as many people as possible. But it's going to require a lot of work, a lot of fundraising, a lot of time. We'll figure it out, Ethan said confidently. We always do. Even with a newborn on the way? Clara asked. Even with a newborn, Ethan confirmed. We have a great team at the foundation. We can delegate, and I'm here to support you however you need. Clara leaned against him. Have I mentioned lately that I love you? Not in the last hour, Ethan teased. I was starting to worry. Clara laughed and stood on her toes to kiss him. I love you, Ethan Hale, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. I love you too, Clara Hale, Ethan replied. Thank you for keeping me as your emergency contact. Best decision you never knew you made. Best decision I ever made was falling in love with you, Clara corrected. Keeping you as my emergency contact was just smart planning. They stood there watching their children play, wrapped in each other's arms, and Ethan felt a peace he'd never known in all his years of chasing success. This was success, not the deals or the money or the power. This, family, love, building something that mattered with the person who mattered most. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, a process that took significantly longer than it should have, because Ellie kept asking for just one more story, and Tommy kept escaping from his crib. Ethan and Clara collapsed on the couch, together. We have to come up with a better bedtime routine, Clara said, her head on Ethan's shoulder. We say that every night, Ethan pointed out. And yet, Clara said, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes from years of knowing someone deeply. Then Clara said, do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? If I'd never kept you as my emergency contact? If the hospital had called someone else? Ethan thought about it seriously. I think I would have spent the rest of my life being successful and miserable, wondering what I was missing but never admitting it. Why? That's sad, Clara said. It is, Ethan agreed. But it didn't happen. You kept my name. The hospital called, and I showed up. You did, Clara said softly. You really did. And I'll keep showing up, Ethan promised. For you, for our kids, for every day of the rest of our lives. Clara lifted her head to look at him. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think we saved each other," she said. "You weren't the only one who was lost. I was too. I was so busy surviving that I'd forgotten how to actually live. But then you showed up at that hospital, and you reminded me that I was worth saving, that I was worth more than just working myself to death." "We're quite the pair," Ethan said with a slight smile. "Two people who had to almost lose everything to figure out what really mattered." "But we figured it out," Clara said. "That's what counts." Ethan pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Yeah, we did." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, listening to the quiet sounds of their home, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock in the hallway, the soft breathing of their children asleep upstairs. This was home, not because of the building or the neighborhood or the expensive furniture, but because of the people in it, the love that filled it, the life they'd built together from the broken pieces of who they used to be. 10 years after that phone call that changed everything, Ethan and Clara stood together at the opening of the 10th Eleanor Bennett Center, this one in San Francisco. Their 3 children, Ellie, now 15 and passionate about social justice, Tommy, 12 and obsessed with building things, and Grace, 8 and determined to be a doctor, stood beside them as they cut the ribbon. The foundation had helped over 100,000 families. Clara's book had sparked a national conversation about medical debt reform, and Ethan had used his business expertise and connections to push for legislative changes that protected vulnerable patients. But as they stood together, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the work they'd done, Ethan knew that none of those achievements mattered as much as the simple fact that Clara's hand was in his. That after 10 years of marriage, he still woke up grateful every morning that she'd chosen him, that their children were healthy and happy, and growing up knowing they were unconditionally loved, that he'd finally learned the difference between success and fulfillment. After the ceremony, as they drove home with their exhausted children in the back seat, Clara said, "Can you believe it's been 10 years? Since the hospital call?" Ethan asked. "Since everything changed," Clara clarified. Ethan reached over and took her hand. "Best 10 years of my life." "Mine too," Clara said. "Though I have to say I'm grateful we're past the phase where we had 3 kids under 6. Ethan laughed. "That was intense." "Intense is one word for it," Clara said. "Exhausting is another, but worth it," Ethan said, glancing in the rearview mirror at their sleeping children. "Absolutely worth it," Clara agreed. When they got home and carried the kids to bed, well, carried Grace, since the older 2 could walk themselves, Ethan and Clara finally had a quiet moment, alone on the back porch of their brownstone. The city glittered around them, but here, in their small garden with its string lights and overgrown flowers, they had a pocket of peace. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "About what?" "About writing another book," she said. "Not about medical debt this time. About us. About second chances and showing up and building something real from broken pieces." "You think people would want to read that?" Ethan asked. "I think people need hope," Clara said. "They need to know that it's never too late to change, to choose love, to build the life you actually want instead of the one you think you're supposed to have." Ethan considered this. "You'd have to write about me being an idiot for years." "Oh, that's definitely going in there," Clara said with a grin. "But also about how you changed, how you learned, how you became the man you are now." "I'm only this man because of you," Ethan said. "No," Clara said firmly. "You're this man because you chose to be. I just gave you a reason to want to." Ethan pulled her close. "Write the book, tell our story. If it helps even one person find the courage to change, it'll be worth it." "Our story," Clara repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." "Me too," Ethan said. They sat together in the garden, wrapped in each other's arms, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a sterile hospital room where everything could have ended, to this moment surrounded by the life and love and family they'd built together. Ethan thought about the man he used to be, lonely, driven, convinced that success meant isolation and that love was a weakness. And he thought about the man he'd become, a husband, a father, a partner in building something that actually mattered. The change hadn't been easy. There had been stumbles and setbacks and moments when old habits threatened to resurface. But Clara had been there through all of it, patient when he needed patience, firm when he needed firmness, loving when he needed love most. She'd saved him, and he'd saved her. And together, They'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of who they used to be. "Ethan?" Clara said softly. "Yeah? Thank you." "For what?" "For answering that phone call," Clara said. "For showing up. For staying. For loving me even when I was too scared to believe in it." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for keeping me as your emergency contact, for giving me a second chance, for building this incredible life with me." Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We're pretty good at this, aren't we?" "At what?" "At being partners, at building something real, at loving each other." "We are," Ethan agreed, "though it took us a while to figure it out. The best things usually do," Clara said. They sat there as the night deepened around them, the city humming in the distance, their children safe and sleeping upstairs, their hands clasped together. And Ethan understood with perfect clarity that this was everything he'd ever needed. Not the money or the power or the success. Just this. Just her. Just the life they'd built together, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of showing up at a time. He'd received a call from a hospital that day, telling him someone he cared about needed him. And by answering it, by showing up, by choosing love over fear, he'd found everything he didn't even know he was looking for. Home, family, purpose, and a love that proved that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be. Sometimes the most important call you'll ever receive is the one that forces you to confront what really matters. Sometimes showing up for someone else is actually showing up for yourself. And sometimes the greatest success isn't measured in dollars or achievements, but in the love you give and the lives you touch. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share your thoughts, your own stories of second chances, or just let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories about love, redemption, and the courage to change are what we're all about. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And remember, it's never too late to answer the call that changes everything. Until next time.